If you've just finished Resident Evil Requiem, there's one Resident Evil game you absolutely need to get to. It has the most terrifying villains Capcom has ever written, the best location and the most atmospheric location you've ever seen in a Resident Evil, and the most consistently brilliant stretch of Resident Evil you will witness in any Resident Evil game, with very few valleys and a lot of big highs. But sadly, it also has one of the most disappointing final stretches in any Resident Evil game, and that's because what came before that final stretch is utterly fantastic. And that game is Resident Evil 7. And today I am making the case for why you should go back and revisit it or visit it for the first time, because for the most part, Resident Evil 7 is a modern day classic. So yeah, I just finished Resident Evil Requiem 3 times now, and honestly, it completely reignited my love for this franchise. More than any other Resident Evil game in recent years, yes, even more than Resident Evil 4. And that's because Requiem feels like a love letter to everything that Resident Evil has ever been. Not just action, not just survival horror, but all of it. And after finishing Requiem, I've just had this urge to go back and experience everything all over again. In the last week or 10 days, I have finished Resident Evil 9, Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 3, and now I'm going through Resident Evil 2. And honestly, it's been one of the most relaxing, in a weird survival horror kind of way, and enjoyable weeks of gaming I've had in a really long time. And the first one I had to go back to was Resident Evil 7. Now, I never finished Resident Evil 7 when it first came out. I had some personal things going on in my life, and I just dropped the game and never went back to it, but I'd played it enough to kind of get a feel for it. But for obvious reasons, I didn't remember anything that happened in RE7, and after playing 9 and after playing through the first person sections of 9, I felt brave enough to go back to 7 because I actually have a fear of first person horror games, mostly brought about by Hideo Kojima's PT. And so I felt I could go back and give Resident Evil 7 a proper go through, and I am so happy I did. It is a horrifyingly joyous experience. So Resident Evil 7 does one thing to an elite level, and that is tension for the most part. And you're going to hear that a lot from me. I'm going to say for the most part because the ending segment, like I said in the intro, is the outlier in this video game, sadly. But let's just talk about the other 90% of the game, and the tension is peak. A lot of horror games rely heavily on jump scares, loud noises, monsters appears out of nowhere, player panics, etc. Resident Evil 7 sparingly uses jump scares, and the effectiveness therefore is so much stronger and heavier. The real fear here comes from anticipation as well as brilliantly written characters, and we will come on to them in a minute. Walking down a hallway, hearing creaking floorboards, reaching for a door. That's a key thing here as well. For the first time in a very long time, Resident Evil 7 gave me that classic Resident Evil feeling of being terrified to open a door. Do you remember that first animation in Resident Evil 1? When you opened the door and you didn't know what was on the other side? I felt that again in Resident Evil 7. But what steals the show here is the Baker family. I don't think a Resident Evil game has had better written antagonists ever. Jack Baker, Margaret, Lucas, they aren't just boss fights, they are full-on characters and experiences. They talk to you, chase you, taunt you, psychologically manipulate you, and constantly make their presence felt throughout the game. And they all have their own slant on horror. One is bringing in the classic stalker trope, the other a Saw-like puzzle, the other a kind of evil, terrifying hide-and-seek game, each terrifying in their own right. Comparing to many Resident Evil villains who appear briefly before disappearing into the background, the Bakers feel like they own this entire experience. They are memorable, disturbing, and strangely charismatic at the same time, and genuinely what I think makes them so scary is they are steeped in realism. They are steeped in real life. These people could kind of actually exist, and as a result for me, they are easily the best antagonists ever in a Resident Evil game. If you disagree, let me know in the comments which antagonist you felt was better. Talking of characters, I feel that one of the biggest characters that needs a mention here is the Baker house. genuinely, in my opinion, the best location Capcom has ever created alongside the brilliant villains. And I think that all in all is what promotes and what really pushes Resident Evil 7 in the conversation of one of the greatest Resident Evils. The rotting Louisiana plantation is claustrophobic, decaying and unsettlingly believable. Every hallway feels so narrow, every room feels like something horrible has happened there. What makes it so effective isn't just the design, but how the game uses the space. You learn the layout, unlocking the shortcuts, circling back through familiar rooms, and realizing that nowhere in this house ever truly feels safe. Helped, I felt a lot by the grandma just randomly appearing in places. She was bloody terrifying. Harking back to the original Spencer Mansion from the original Resident Evil, the Baker House becomes a character in its own right. But where the mansion feels mysterious, the Baker House feels hostile, terrifying, spine-tingling, like the building itself is rotting around you. And that constant sense of decay and rot and dread is exactly what makes exploring it so uncomfortable and so memorable. Identity is something that truly separates Resident Evil 7 from many other Resident Evils. If there's one criticism of some of the less good Resident Evils, is that they don't really know who they are. The tone shifts too much, almost at breakneck speeds. The only time that tone shift has actually worked, in my opinion, is Resident Evil 9, where due to the two different characters, the cathartic release of Leon really works against the backdrop of the fear of Grace. However, when you go through other games, for example with Resident Evil 8, I don't think the tonal shifts work anywhere near as much. But in Resident Evil 7, they don't try tonal shifts. Being hypercritical, you could argue the last hour is a slight shift. But overall, this is a horror game and it goes all in on the horror aspect and it knows exactly what it wants to be. There's no confusion about tone, and like I said, that's something I feel the franchise has struggled with at times within each game. Resident Evil 7 doesn't try to balance anything, it simply commits to being terrifying. And that focus gives the entire experience a really strong sense of direction. Now, the game isn't without problem. The bigger one I'll touch upon in a minute, but one of the criticisms leveled at Resident Evil 7 is enemy variety. And though that is true, I've got to admit, I didn't really notice the enemy variety till I reflected upon the game at the end. And it wasn't even in my notes actually, which tells you how much I enjoyed that core experience. The fear of the Bakers is an enemy in itself, and due to the different family members, I feel like there's enough variety in the type of tension psychologically that you're feeling that it does feel varied enough. However, it is a fair criticism. These mud zombies or whatever they are, these mud monsters, are not good enemies. They're not well designed, they're not interesting, they're not varied. They are, for all intents and purposes, pretty dull and muddy. And I guess it didn't bother me because the atmosphere does so much of the heavy lifting. The constant sense of dread, the feeling of impending doom, and the oppressive environment almost mask this lack of variety. Is definitely still a flaw, but is one that the game's horror managed to cover surprisingly well. So let's talk about the core issues that Resident Evil 7 faces and the criticisms that a lot of people will give it when arguing that it isn't as good as what people like to say. And that is, of course, the final act. And by final act, I'm talking about everything from the ship onwards. Without a doubt, the peak of the game is the Baker House sections, and everything after that definitely feels weaker. And I gotta admit, even before I got to the final boss, I was thinking in my head, I was like, this is all becoming very Resident Evil 80 towards the end. These bland corridors with enemy gauntlets, all just invoking no feelings at all, which is the worst thing in a Resident Evil game. I didn't think the ship section was as bad as what many people claim. It wasn't great, however, but it does lose something important, and that is an antagonizing factor such as the Bakers. Without that central villain constantly driving the tension, the narrative feels noticeably less engaging. I don't want to spoil too much about the story, but the villain that is in the ship section onwards just isn't anywhere near as good. Then we have the final stretch, which, other than a gauntlet of enemies, is a truly anticlimactic, would be doing it a favor, a terrible final boss that I actually couldn't believe was the ending of the game. I kind of stood there shocked that that's how they decided to end the game, and that is without a big issue with it. However, I don't think it's unique to Resident Evil 7. If anything, if we're being really honest about Resident Evil games, I'd say the endings are almost always the worst part of a Resident Evil game. Underwhelming, disappointing, a glorified QTE, none of it is untrue. But even though the endings are often the weakest part of Resident Evil games, it is particularly weak here, and therefore it does stop Resident Evil 7 from being my favorite Resident Evil game. Now, in this next section, I just want to say this. There's a brief story spoiler here regarding the Bakers. So this is your spoiler warning. It's about 10 seconds worth of me talking, so 1, 2, 3, let's go. There's one story decision I really didn't like, and that's because I think it takes away from the mystique of the Bakers. The revelation that the Baker family were essentially victims of Evelyn's infection. On one hand, it adds a touch of tragedy to their story, but on the other hand, it does make them slightly less interesting as villains. That's just my take. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. Part of what made them so disturbing earlier in the game was how genuinely cruel and unpredictable they seemed. Once the infection explains their behavior, some of that menace disappeared for me. It's not a huge issue, but it does slightly change how I personally picture them in my kind of mind lore. So, is Resident Evil 7 the best Resident Evil ever? My answer is actually pretty close to yes, but not quite. Resident Evil 7 has the best tension in the franchise, the best written villains in the series ever, and one of the best locations Capcom has ever designed. But those final hours and that incredibly anticlimactic ending stop it just short of being the absolute best. Still, there's one thing that's hard to argue against. Resident Evil 7 might not be the greatest Resident Evil ever made, but it will always be remembered as the most terrifying the franchise ever was. That's all I have really on Resident Evil 7. I hope everybody goes back and played it. If you've not played it yet, highly recommend it, especially if you enjoyed the grey sections of Resident Evil 9. Go back and play this, you will be thrilled that you did. I've just finished Resident Evil 3 Remake and I've got some thoughts on that. Not all of them entirely negative, but there's a reason for that, and if you want to know what that reason is, you can click on the video when it comes live in a few days' time. Other than that, take care, peace, and look after yourselves. Like, subscribe if you'd like to help me out. Peace, bye.